introductions. Hi, I'm Bekah.
Hi, Bekah.
Okay.
I'm Robbie.
Okay. I'm Kelly. Cool. So a little bit about, alright, I am a former policy reader who then did LD for 2 years, and I now serve for Green Hill. Robbie.
I LD for 4 years, and I ran a lot of policy arguments.
Yeah, he ran. Yeah. Good. And then Kelly.
I did policy debate for 4 years.
So this is kind of hopefully going to be a nice little translation, right, of politics DAs into LD, particularly taking account of like differences in time, but still not lacking the substance, right? Make sense? Yeah, if you have any questions, raise your hand, stop us, right? Be a little bit interactive, hopefully. Okay. So what is a disad? Does everyone in this room know what a disad is? Raise your hand if you don't know what a disad is. Okay, good. Just in case, though. Sorry, we have the uniqueness, which is what?
Description of squad.
Exactly, this description of the status quo. Then we have the link, which is what? Right, something that changes the quo. And then we have the impact, which was what happens because of the change. Make sense? That's kind of understood. And in LD, this is the form most disads take, right? This is as complex as they get. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? So, how can we add more? We have a break. Why the status quo is precarious, right? Why this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We also have things like uniqueness, right? Why the app action uniquely is what will change the status quo. It's not just it's a straw on the camel's back, it's the detrimental straw. Then we also have other things like internal links, and those create the stair steps between the link and the impact and the terminal impact. What's great about disads? What's fun about them? Has everybody run a disad? Bennett, what's fun about a disad?
Everything. I don't know how to answer that.
That's what's fun about a disad. World goes boom.
Nuclear bombs.
Right? Everything gets pretty fun because it starts out kind of small and then you're like, right? Kind of fun. Okay, so what is that difference between a disad and a politics disad? Any ideas? When you came to the politics disad, like elective and sign up, what were you expecting? Like, has anybody heard a politics disad before? Okay. Are they different than a normal disad?
Is that
Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Are they different?
Yes.
How?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I guess a normal disad could be any sort of link chain. A politics disad is normally like legislation will pass, but the plan causes like a loss of political capital or something like that, which causes legislation not to pass.
Right. It's a very specific change from the status quo, right? Then we also have midterms disads. It's a very specific type of politics disads. Midterms disads are really, really fun. And when is midterms elections, guys?
November 6th.
Very soon.
November 6th of when? Is it November 6th every single year?
No, every 2 years.
Depends
4
on where it's at, right? So this is important. If you guys are gonna listen, if you're gonna start running talk about politics disad, you better know something about the state of politics, right? Gotta do some research. Kelly, why are midterms disads awesome? Or different?
They're different because instead of focusing on a certain piece of legislation, you're focusing on a certain person getting elected or re-elected. So, and also there are a lot of different impact chains that could come off of that particular disad as opposed to a normal politics disad.
So for a politics disad, we're going to talk about this thing called political capital, right? And so that's based on the current status of who's in office and how they're using their expenditures. And we'll get more into that in here in a second. And a midterms disad, it's a kind of prior question of who even gets into those offices or who stays in those offices.
And we'll talk about it in a little bit as well, but like an example of this would be like 2012, there was a lot of like Obama did bad, Romney did bad arguments that were read, the politics disadvantages that were read, and there's tons
state is all of y'all are going to be really well-informed citizens who will vote, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's right. So one thing that you have to do is understand the process, right? Because, for example, if we're talking about something, like if we're talking about something the AF does, right, and there's no way the Supreme Court can institute a living wage, then anything about the Supreme Court as a disad doesn't make any sense, right? So we have to know, right, we have to understand the process of what's going on. That involves who has jurisdiction, what committee bodies have jurisdiction, when do appointments and elections occur, right? What is a confirmation? Is a confirmation controversial? Are there committees? So one way to do this is to start researching and getting ideas, right? Because this season is going to be really awesome for the midterms DA, right? Because pretty important election in November for some very important states for midterms. So one way to do this is to start checking the news daily. Get Google News updates, right, every day, and try to figure out what's going on, i.e., what policies are likely to pass, who's likely to get elected, what the current description of the squo is like. Because what's important to remember is that in politics, the squo is always in flux. What does that mean? Right, it's always dynamic. So we have to understand the stable process of how it works, because we can't understand the changes that will happen if we don't know the stasis point.
Yeah, you should get an you should like do RSS feeds, especially if you know exactly what you want.
Right.
Like for midterms, you know you want to follow a couple if people who are getting elected, then you can follow the RSS with that.
Right. So we know how to get certain evidence, right? How do we know to understand the processes? It's actually really easy. You read, right? We look through normal means, right? We try to understand how political processes work. Go talk to your AP government teacher at your high school. I'm sure that or your government teacher. Everyone has to have one. I'm sure they would love you to talk to them, right? You have questions, okay? So now we have to talk about understanding the squo. So remember, it's a current state of affairs. The first step to doing this is thinking about important people, right? So, House leaders, right? House leaders have a lot of power. Why? What's a okay, let's just walk through this. Like, what is our political system like now?
Divided by two-party. Divided by
Two-party, okay, right? So, there's an idea of party alignment, people working together to push things, right? So, House leaders are of majority and minority of a two-party system, right, are really important. Does anybody know who a whip is?
Is it the person who whips the votes? I believe it was played by Kevin Spacey on House of Cards for the first season.
Okay, I haven't seen House of Cards.
Oh, well,
That's true.
But it's like the person that goes around through the party, right, and makes sure that everybody in the party is voting a certain way, right? So, for example, what a whip says, or what the whip count is on a certain issue, was going to be more accurate than any other person, right? Because the whip's job in Congress is to go and make sure all the party is working together, is whipping the party into line to what the leader wants. Another thing that is important to recognize are vocal figures. Who is a vocal figure in the government? Okay, when the government shut down, who did that? Who did they blame it on? He's from Texas. Ted Cruz, right? Is Ted Cruz a senior senator? Oh, sorry. Is he I'm so tired. Okay, don't record this anymore. I'm so tired. Right, does he have seniority? No, he's a junior, right? Doesn't have a lot of power. How did he shut down the government?
I believe
Read Dr. Seuss, I believe.
Right, he was able by he had a lot of people agree with him, right? And then he was also able to stop. These people, right, important people, not only should you know how to say their names, right? Because if you do a politics disad and you say like, yeah, if you say if you don't say Boehner and you say something really bad, right, your judge is gonna laugh at you, right? As will your opponent, okay? Or if you say, like Hussein Osama, right, or whatever, and you meet, like, that's gonna sound stupid. But another thing is about these important people, they are also usually reflective of who will be important to stay in election or who will get reelected. So that would be really important people to focus on for the midterms disad. Why? because the way Congress works is it privileges systems of seniority, right? That's the way the government works. You do your time, you get more authority, right? So a person that's in there longer has more authority on certain issues or more power than people who don't. At the same time, they have a longer history of pissing people off, right? So there's more baggage associated with that. So understanding, right, the history of the political party and what happens is really important. Are any questions about the important people? Who are some important people right now in the government? Obama. Obama is pretty important.
Like any of the Supreme Court justices.
Okay. Okay, who else? So let's talk about the legislative branch. Okay, why is Joe Biden important?
He
I'm
leads
sorry?
What's
Okay.
your
He
percentage?
leads
What does he do as the vice
He
president?
leads the Senate or something like
But does
that.
he vote?
No,
When does he vote?
if there's a tie.
Okay, so he could be pretty important, right? Who else?
House Majority Leader and House Minority
Who's
Leader.
Boehner? Sean Boehner? Yeah, who's that?
Speaker of the House.
What?
What?
Republican
Speaker of the
head
House.
of
Okay. He's a Republican. Who's Harry Reid?
Senator.
Yeah. Who's in control of the Senate right now?
Democrats.
Who's John Kerry?
John Kerry.
State.
Oh.
Besides a pacifist war deserter. Who is he? He's a flip-flopper. Who's John Kerry? What?
Secretary of State.
Okay, who used to be Secretary of State?
Clinton.
Haley. Right. What does the Secretary of State do?
I believe something about foreign policy.
Who creates the Secretary of State? Who puts them in place?
President appoints
Obama? Does he have singular authority?
No, he like
No,
recommends
he's
and then.
Oh, who says
But-
no? Who says yes?
Just gonna be the devil's advocate.
So cabinet positions have to be confirmed, right? A lot of positions, like Supreme Court nominees, have to be confirmed, right? So who's in office is generally pretty important, okay?
Who confirms them?
Right? Okay, let's talk about an example of this. Okay, so Clarence Thomas has recently been a pretty important person in certain Supreme Court cases, right? Kind of a deciding factor. He's one of the younger of the conservative justices, right? Definitely not going to be replaced anytime soon unless he like keels over and falls asleep when he dies, right? Which he never talks, so we wouldn't know. But for like example, like when he was being confirmed, does everybody hear about the Anita Hill incident? Who's heard of Anita Hill? Anita Hill. What? Yeah.
I've heard of her. I cannot remember from what.
Okay. Right. So everybody wanted to confirm Clarence Thomas. It seemed like a shoo-in until Anita Hill was like, "Hey, he sexually harassed me," and then there was more issue about that, and so then the confirmation took longer. Right. Some people, right, don't even get confirmed at all because there's so much controversy around them. This is the same for cabinet positions. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. So how do these people get what they want? Political capital. Who knows what political capital is? Alex.
It's like when a corporation says, "Do something for us, and we'll give you your campaign money."
Okay. Kind of. Think about political capital specifically. Jacob.
How much influence you have?
Influence,
Oh.
right?
Got that wrong.
Right? It's okay. So the idea, right? So is political capital like a charge card? Does it run on a deficit?
No, probably not.
Probably not, right? The idea is, right, so political capital describes the ability to influence, right? The ability to push an agenda, the ability to negotiate compromise, right? So for example, Ted Cruz, right? Is anybody really going to listen to Ted Cruz anymore?
Is that a no?
Some people.
Some people will.
Unfortunately, yes.
Right, some people will, right? But does he hold the same, does he spend a lot of capital getting the government shut down, right? So by capital, think about all your interactions with people, right? Social capital. Let's say you want, does everyone understand this concept? Who doesn't? It's okay, you don't. So it's also about quid pro quo, right? So let's say you're hanging out with your sibling, right? And your sibling's like, "Hey, will you do my chores tonight? And you're like, okay, I'll do your chores tonight. And they give you like some candy. If they keep on asking you to do the chores for them, the candy's not going to seem so great, right? It's the law of diminishing returns. Even if we get paid the same amount, it's still going to suck, right? Okay. So, political capital. Who has political capital? Who's what? Obama. Why? He spends it?
He's president.
Because he's president, right. Okay. Who else has political capital? What? Yeah, like the leaders, right? The ability for them to influence things. So political capital swells, right, when you work together. Most links, right, that we talk about for the politics disad have to do with political capital. Why? Jacob.
If no one has any political capital, then they can't get anything done, or if someone has too much political capital, then they can influence things the way they want.
Okay, so we know that the status quo is a description, right? So, if we say, right now, something is going to pass, right? Something that's important. Then what happens so when the plan, right, like on the AF, if the AF results in a change from the status quo, what do we call that? Has anybody heard fiat before? Raise your hand if you've heard of fiat. Okay, good. Everybody's on the same page. Sounds great. Okay, so fiat would say that the plan will pass, but let's say the AF is controversial. So that would sometimes result in a loss of political capital, which means that thing that was originally going to be passed, that Obama was going to spend his political capital on, he can't do any longer because he used it to fiat. Make sense? Fiat the AF plan.
Could it be like a law that is going to be get rid of, but like somebody's preventing them because they have like a lot of political capital, but then like they lose that and then the laws.
Sometimes, but you have to remember, this is the most important thing about a link. You have to show why what the AF does results in a change from the status quo situation, right? So you could say the status quo situation is that this bill is going to be removed, right? And that they're going to agree to do that. But if we make them any angrier, they won't do it. What makes them angry is instituting the living wage, right? Therefore, the bill won't pass, and then the world goes boom, right? Make sense? Okay. Next we have a thing about projected election results. The way you can research this is you can get it from the Gallup poll. The Gallup poll is a national institute that does a lot of surveys. A couple problems is that they usually conduct their surveys through telephone, so you have to understand about that through sample size. Who still has a landline, right? Because it's only through landlines, random calls at landlines. So that might not be an issue. The other thing is, where else do we hear about election results? Right, the things that we do. The interesting thing about media is that media is both descriptive and creative. What does that mean?
They like describe stuff, but they take liberty sometimes with statistics, as in like they'll question a certain like or like a certain group of people.
Right.
Or like things like that.
Right. There's this great clip. I was trying to find a link to it, but I think it got taken down. It's during the Obama-McCain election, and so a Fox News reporter like walks into an IHOP and is like, "Raise your hand if you're voting for Obama," and like everybody raises their hand. And then he's like, "Raise your hand if you're voting for McCain," and then like 2 people raise their hand, and the reporter's like, "As you can see, it's a pretty even split." Right? It's funny, right? So yes, that is one way. It is both reflective and descriptive and creative, as in they're creative with facts. But I mean creative in another way. What way? If you hear that your candidate, that your favorite candidate is going to lose no matter what are you more likely to do? Not vote, right? So sometimes the analysis of what the media describes also creates a new situation. Does that make sense? So not only is it descriptive, what it describes can also influence political stasis. So remember, flux and stasis, politics is never stable, which is why you need to constantly cut updates. Which is why sending things to your, like having notifications from Google, it's really, really helpful. Really, really good. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Now let's talk about the docket. Kelly's going to talk about the docket.
Awesome. So basically basically in politics there's a docket, or basically a list of legislation of things that congressmen will talk about, and top of the docket would indicate they're about to talk about it. It's at the top list of their priorities. Bottom of the docket would indicate that it is at the bottom. The way that this argument could be used in debate is if it's at the bottom of the docket, that means they're not even discussing it in Congress right now, so it's not unique.
So remember, the idea is the description of the SQO, right? And they say link. Generally, the AF plan happens instantly, right? Normal means. So if you're giving a description of the SQO is this plan will pass, but that plan is at the bottom of the docket, then the plan, which would result in a change, doesn't affect it as much because its perceptual idea, right, or the effect of it isn't felt because it's not at the same time. They're not occurring simultaneously. Make sense? The other thing is if it's at the top of the docket, right, the reaction because of the AF plan or the fiat is more likely to affect, right, because it's at the top of the docket. They occur simultaneously. Make sense? Another thing that creates the docket that you want to think about is sessions versus special sessions. So for example, last June, right, Wendy Davis and a bunch of people in Texas filibustered Senate Bill 5, right? That was a special session. That filibuster got a lot of notice, right, to stop Senate Bill 5 from passing. But then what happened the next day? Anybody? Anybody following the news?
They tried to pass it again.
Right, they called another special session, and then it passed. Right? So, if you can't get it now, maybe they could do the status quo thing that is good later. Right? If they can't pass the bill now, and it's not on the top of the docket, maybe they can pass it later. So again, what the act does, you're not contesting the link, right, or the change from the SQO. You're just saying it wouldn't cause a bad thing to happen. Not saying it wouldn't cause a loss in political capital, right, but it wouldn't affect to lead to the next stair step. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Another thing you want to think about is the election projection effect on the docket. What is that? Any ideas?
People are trying to figure out what their people are going to run for. Like, for instance, if, let's say, immigration law is really big in the United States and someone who wants to run for election really wants to say, oh, I'm going to pass an immigration law, and if they have a lot of political capital, then it's going to be at the top of the docket so they can talk about it in an actual session.
Okay. Good start. So another thing is, like, politicians want to have a lifelong career, right? A lifelong politician, because remember, we're already established, the longer you're in politics, the more influence you have, right? So if that means that if your election scenario is happening and you're going to be elected in your home state, you don't want to do anything that's going to mess with your home state's making you angry and risking your reelection, right? If you know you're not going to get reelected, right, you're more likely to do things whatever you want. Like, this is especially important, like, so for example, Obama would probably be more likely to push controversial things and use all this political clout at the end of his second term. Why?
Because he's not going to be president.
Right. This is his last, it's do or die, right? It's his last chance to do these things. Whereas in the beginning, the first law he passed was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. Right? That was the first bill he signed into law when he became president in 2008. That's not super controversial, right? Women getting paid equally. Some people that think that's controversial, right? But the act was just a declaration. It didn't do anything mandatory, right? It just said women should be paid equally. There should be no gender discrimination. So that's not controversial because there's nothing the federal government was mandating, but it was helpful too because, oh, it sounds like a good thing, right? Make sense? Any questions? Another thing that has reflect on that is sometimes people will question voting records, right? So if you're up for election and you are voting on something, a lot of times people will call in like an absentee, or they will not vote at all. This is something Obama was called out for because he had most of his voting record. He was present for the scenario, so he was helping make quorum. So quorum is how many people have to be in Congress at one time in order for Congress to vote on something. Does that make sense? So a lot of people will not vote, so it won't show up on their record and won't make people angry. But sometimes not voting makes people angry. And sometimes not voting can affect the status quo or the plan, right? Or the effects of the plan. Make sense? Any questions? Does everybody know all this? Okay. We'll move quickly then. Link analysis. What's winners lose? Robbie, take it away. Sorry, I didn't realize you're chewing.
Robbie has priorities.
Alright. What does winners lose? Anyone know? So,
What do you think it means?
Maybe actually pass something like the legislation we lose political capital.
okay. Right. What does it mean there?
So, my understanding is it would be the opposite of winners win. So probably like, if Obama, because he's the president, passes a very controversial bill.
I.e. the plan.
Yeah, the plan. The more controversial said legislation, i.e. plan, is, like the more political capital he would use.
Yeah, right, so it's the idea that whenever the plan happens, it's pushed through Congress, and it costs him a lot of political capital to do so. Like we assumed, it cost him a lot of political capital to do so. He lost political capital when he was trying to pass the plan.
Because we assume, right, that the plan will pass.
Yeah.
So this is why it's important to also cut specific updates in relation to those specific plans, right? So, to be a reason, so understanding, right, if the living wage, for example, on this topic, would have an effect at all, if people care about it. My instinct is saying that, a lot of people have very strong feelings about living wage and employer mandates, if the Affordable Care Act says anything. So we have winners win, which is what?
Somebody else, based on
This discussion. What do you think winners win is, Allie?
Oh, when they manage to gain capital because they pass something.
Exactly, right? Plan passes and that force of strength, right, because it's hard to push through, leads to a net increase in political capital. What kind of argument would that be against the link? Corey, any ideas? Is that a no-link argument? What does that mean?
Be a link argument since they're like winning political cap.
I know, but is that a no-link, or what does it do with the link?
Strengthens link.
Which we call a link turn, right? So if they say you result in a loss of political capital, the link turn would say, no, winners win. By forcing things through, we have more political clout. Because people see how powerful and strong we are with our big, burly political muscles. Okay, any questions? And again, this is all on the link debate, right? The link and internal link debate. Link issues. So how, right, this is all things to take into account. So the first is the pocket veto.
Okay, does anyone know what a pocket veto is? Alright, so yeah.
Isn't that whenever the president doesn't want to officially veto something, so he'll just like waive it and just like not put on it either way?
Yes, but there's something very special about that. So usually if the president doesn't want to sign something or veto it directly, he just leaves it on his desk, eventually it'll just go through and pass anyway. But this happens at the end of the year when there's 11 days left in the legislative term, and he just doesn't sign it until the bill goes away.
So that doesn't cost him capital, right? Because he doesn't have to actually veto it. But the plan, it goes away anyway. So he's not blamed for it, but he is blamed for it because he can be like, it was lost. Like in the old days it came from, this was lost on my desk, right? And now it's just a technique, right? So they can then deny either approval or disapproval of a specific plan by allowing the pocket veto to happen. This would essentially create a no link, right? Does that make sense? That would be the effect. So then we have a lame duck presidency. What does that mean? What is a lame duck?
That's whenever the new president's already been elected, so no one really pays attention to the one who's already voted out of office.
that can create a lame duck issue. What else is a lame duck?
What does it do to the president? Like, if the president's a lame duck president, what's he more likely to do? We talked about this earlier. What's a lame duck president more likely to try to do? Yeah, right? There's no reason not to, because they might as well try, and they have nothing to lose.
Right, because they have nothing. The idea of a lame duck president is they have nothing. So yeah, they're going to maybe think about controversial things, but the likelihood of them doing it, or likelihood of them using political capital, is nil, because they have no political capital. Sometimes we have things where you don't know someone's a lame duck, or you think someone's a lame duck, and then they're able to push something. Bush was a really important example of this. A lot of people considered him in his last term a lame duck, but he was still able to push through certain things, particularly in terms of like family values or social issues, right? That did cost him political capital, and was able to exude those things, and what was not suspected, right? So lame duck is not necessarily an absolute term, because remember, politics are always in flux. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. Then the other thing we want to talk about is court decisions. What was one of the most recent court decisions that came out that everybody got up in arms about?
The Hobby Lobby one.
What did the Hobby Lobby case say? Okay. What did that say? Did they say that?
It said that businesses were that corporations were people, and that they could express religious freedom.
Well, there was a previous case that said corporations were people.
Citizens United.
Right. So the Hobby Lobby case is about the idea that they can have religious exemptions in order to federal mandates. What? Okay, that was a court decision, a Supreme Court decision. It's unconstitutional to make something. What did the legislative body do to subvert that? It's not getting a lot of attention. Basically, that decision is not going to be upheld. Why? In the legislative system. It's not going to affect the Affordable Care Act. Why? Any ideas? Because the legislative body and the Senate has gotten together to say that the Affordable Care Act is exempted from the law that allows for religious exemption. Does that make sense? So even though the court says employers have a right to deny mandates based on closely held religious beliefs, right? That is what is exempt from that is federal law. If there's a federal mandate, everyone has to do it regardless. That's a bill that's being passed right now. Make sense? So yeah, the court says one thing, right? Because everyone thinks about something, it goes somewhere else, right? And the legislative body does something else. That's why we have a system of checks and balances. The other thing to keep in mind is executive orders. What is an executive order? Executive Order number 666. It's an important thing in
That was the one
in
about
Star Wars, yeah. That killed all the Jedis. Okay, but what is an executive order? Anybody who hasn't spoken yet have an idea? Kat, what's an executive order? It's okay if you don't know. What do you think it is? Right. Executive orders are, what's the example of an executive order? Anybody?
the one back during John F. Kennedy's thing where he was going to something about the Federal Reserve. He was going to have the U.S. government print money instead of the Federal Reserve, but then it didn't happen because he got assassinated.
Right, because the executive order can only have solvency, right, or it can only cause change if it's something within the executive power. This is what one thing that probably all of you are familiar with is No Child Left Behind. Who has heard of No Child Left Behind? Well, you have to take all these stupid tests, right, in school. So that is what we call an unfunded mandate. Why? The executive cannot allocate funds for school systems to do this, but instead they mandate that it happens. That make sense? So you want to think about whether or not the plan or a counter plan could be an executive order. Because often, executive orders could escape legislative political capital issues, but they would cost political capital to the president. So it also matters in the link scenario, who does what political capital. Make sense? Any questions? Are you all just tired? Then we have also ideas of alternative enforcement mechanisms, right? So normally he said, what do most people say at the end end of a plan text? A reserve the right to clarify. What else? Bennett, what happens when somebody reserves the right to clarify?
They're really sketchy about what the plan does.
Right, because the idea is there's a normal means for the plan to do, right? And they're going to default to that. But they have a plan idea, and then reserving the right to clarify is like, oh, well, actually, this is the branch of government that does it, right? And they don't specify that till later. That's pretty sketchy, right?
Yeah.
Because it basically makes the app not a stasis point, right? It makes it it makes it a moving target. Make sense? So an alternative enforcement mechanism, so this is another thing that you can be keeping in mind, and this is another reason why it's important to understand the process, because if they are talking about, like, unfunded mandates, right? Is the living wage an unfunded mandate? If it makes employers do it?
Yes.
It could be. It doesn't have to be, right? But these are things to take into account, right? And how those alternative enforcement mechanisms result. So another issue is perceptual, right? So, for example, let's say their link scenario is about a midterms and a certain person getting elected, and then the internal link is, right, or the link is that living wage hurts this person's political, like, clout, makes them unpopular, right? Does it matter who they are unpopular with? Who says yes? Who says no? Anybody say no? Right, so if it's a midterms disad, right, what matters is it only matters if it makes them unpopular with their constituents. If they're from Florida and it makes them unpopular with people in Michigan, no one cares, right? This is another thing to make sure that when you're researching, that you're getting correct perceptual links, right? And the links make logical sense. It can't just be enough to say, oh, this is unpopular. It needs to be unpopular with who, unpopular why, and unpopular when. Make sense? Or alternatively, popular. Because sometimes you have policies disads that are like the opposite. But that usually happens when the app is, when the resolution is quo. Like, is the status quo. Does that make sense? And those are more complicated and less likely resolutions. Okay. Then we have how we can answer the link. Okay?
Alright. So, does anyone think you know what fiat self-link means?
I'll try.
Take a
Okay.
whack.
I'm not sure. I might mix entries.
It's okay,
So
it's good.
my prediction is that it's the argument that you do not lose any political capital when you pass the plan. You use fiat that it happens, so it never actually goes through Congress.
That's exactly what it is.
Right, it's magic. Fiat is a magic wand.
Why do you guys think that's problematic for the person debating that argument?
And if you're Meg,
Right, why do we have fiat?
So you
they-
can
Then there's
debate
clash.
consequences.
yeah.
Right, so you can debate the advantages and disadvantages of passing. If fiat is a magic wand, right, then that takes away ground. And it is counterproductive to the intention of fiat, which is to include ground. Because we understand that there is more ground to be had with bad things that could happen if something changes versus why this thing would never happen. One is defensive and one is offensive.
Also, the way that fiat solves the link is phrased around usually, it means not only would you not have politics decide, you would have no disad because you're just debating the consequences of the plan.
Right. So there'd be it would only be turns, right? Direct turns under their case would apply. No external disad for what other change in the status quo. So for example, if they say living wage decreases poverty, you would be, if fiat solves the link, you would only be relegated to no, fiat increases poverty. Instead of saying fiat increases poverty by increasing unemployment, oh, BT dubs, increasing unemployment leads to economic decline, leads to world goes boom. Make sense? Okay. We also have the idea of intrinsicness. Who can explain that? What does it mean to be intrinsic? Go ahead, Bennett.
Might also get this one wrong, but
It's fine.
my understanding is that if the app says non-intrinsic to the plan, it just means that a rational policymaker would, if they realize that bad stuff was gonna happen, they would just pass both bills, the plan and like immigration or whatever.
Right, exactly. So it's the idea that it's probably okay to pass it. Like the plan is so good, right, that or such an important issue or such a pressing issue that whatever, there's no disadvantage that would come from it. It's another way to contest the link, right? It's different than saying, it's similar to saying no link, but it's not so much a link term. Make sense? Any questions? Does everyone understand that? Sure. So it would be like saying, everyone, it's usually based on like consensus, so everyone agrees that the plan is a good idea because it's really important. So for example, like after 9/11, everybody was like, let's go catch the terrorists, right? Let's go stop this. Everyone agreed that was a good idea. Whereas later, right, we had to talk about the disadvantages of that. So it didn't affect the political capital as much as you think it did because everyone was in agreement that it was a good thing to do. Make sense? So the problems were garnered from the link, right, are intrinsic to the act. That's why it's called intrinsicness. Okay? And let's talk about vote no. Which is really, really dumb. You should not make this argument. Anybody know what it means? Anybody have an idea? If you were asked, right, you said vote no to answer the link, what do you think that means? Mostly it's just, oh, they won't actually vote, right, for the thing that you say is going to happen, right? That vote doesn't happen. Or they'll just vote no on the plan. And it's basically fiating, right, that whatever way the vote needs to go will happen. Again, kind of sketchy. Make sense? Then we have compartmentalization. What's that? Any idea?
What does it sound like with respect to legislation?
It sounds. I think I've heard of it. I'm probably not right, but
It's
it's
fine.
something about like it's like a need to know basis sort of thing, something like that.
Not really. So compartmentalization is basically the idea that whenever certain politicians push legislation, it's isolated in that one instance, so people don't think about it again. So it's just like things that happen with like immigration reform stick with immigration reform, and they don't think about it in other instances. So they would connect legislation's stance on immigration reform to their stance on like welfare.
Right, so for example, our discussions about living wage, right, don't have anything to do with our discussions about immigration, right? They can be compartmentalized conversations, right? So, yeah, even if you get upset with me about the living wage, it's not going to affect us working together on immigration. Make sense? Compartmentalization assumes that most politicians are issue-specific rather than party alignment-specific, which, considering party politics, if the whip is not good enough, generally can happen a lot. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Then we have ideas of time frame as regular means, right? We say plan happens instantly, right? What happens if a session is not in date? Can a plan pass instantly? Or maybe a special session will be called, right? This happens when you're asked. A lot of people will say if the disad is a net benefit to a counterplan, or the counterplan is just do the plan but not now, right? The perm would be do the plan Friday after 5 p.m. commonly. Why?
Because
Say it again.
No one watches the news on Friday after 5 p.m.
Right, and so this would solve perceptual issues of links, right? It wouldn't solve perceptual issues amongst legislative bodies themselves, right? Because legislative bodies know what are going on, but it would solve for popularity issues amongst the constituents, right? People who vote for the legislative body. So it makes. I'm sorry. Oh yeah. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about uniqueness versus the link. And very, very important for politics debate. Why?
You have too many uniqueness to eliminate that.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So what is the idea of uniqueness overwhelms the link? Jacob.
Just because the link, just because you have a link that proves that the government's going to shut down if you caused it just as much as I do. It doesn't matter which one was caused the leak. It's not my fault.
Okay, somewhat, yeah. Bennett?
I guess an example would be like if Uniqueness's CIR will pass now, and then the plan is like a little unpopular, Uniqueness overwhelms the link would be like, immigration reform is so popular that it will pass anyway.
Right. So, the uniqueness is, it will pass now, the description of the quo. It's the idea that the change from the status quo is not significant enough to deviate from the uniqueness, right? I.e., if this plan is really, really popular, right? So this is why, if you're running a politics disad, it's probably going to be more important to cut really specific evidence, but maybe about something that has a higher brink, maybe a more tenuous issue. That we're agreeing on this right now, but we have to do it right now, right? Make sense? Okay, uniqueness also controls the direction of the link. What does this mean? Any ideas?
So uniqueness controls the direction of the link essentially means that however people react to the plan is because of the status quo. So anything that happens, once the plan passes, people are going to react how they are reacting right now. Does that make sense?
This is because politics are constantly in flux. The same idea, this Fox News can report an idea or like a commentary on something, and that can change how that commentary is accepted, or what it's commentating on is accepted.
The way this argument is usually used is whenever you are getting when you're doing comparative impact analysis, and you're trying to say whose impact is more likely or will have the first.
Right?
Who thinks they know what the link controls the direction of uniqueness means?
Based on that conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so the link controls direction of uniqueness, I think it's a bit more nuanced and more difficult to explain around, but the way I always articulated it is that the link is the only thing that is actually indicative upon the plan. It's the only thing that's actually changed the status quo, so uniqueness is a little sketch. So you should look towards the link as a way to predict what is actually going to happen or how the impact scenario will lay out.
So for example, if there's no link then, and the link controls the direction of the uniqueness, their impact won't occur on yours will, right? So what is uniqueness controls the direction of the link?
The way people react to the plan is because of the status quo.
Exactly, right? People, if we're talking about living wage, right, and everyone agrees that living wage is a good thing, probably because we already have close to a living wage standard, right? Obviously not true, right? But the reason people get upset about a living wage standard is because it's not close to the status quo, right? So then, the link controls the direction of the uniqueness is what? Based on that, we just talked about it, guys.
Uniqueness is like uncertain or sketchy.
Right.
Because it's like just a prediction of the future.
And
It's
what's the
always
link?
The link is like not sketchy.
Because because ideally, right, your link evidence or your contestation of your evidence that counters the link evidence, right, talks about specifically what the plan or the act does, right? The situation specifically related to the app scenario, rather than projected scenarios of extraneous things. Because if everything is in flux, right, can we pinpoint exactly where anything is? No. Make sense? Any questions? This is also a reason we should talk about post-dating right now. What does post-date mean? It's not a post-it, post-date. And it's not when you, like, tell your mom how much your date sucked. Post-date. Come on, guys. You're dead. I'm trying to laugh. I know I'm not funny.
Later than the actual one.
What?
To a document or event.
Right. So post-dating would be like, because the situation is constantly in flux, evidence is why it's important to post-date. Like if your evidence is from 2 weeks ago, and it describes a unique situation of the status quo, and then your evidence is from yesterday, and it has a different understanding of what the description of the quo is, then which one should we default to?
New evidence.
Why?
Because as the newest concept of what the flux is.
Right. So we should, if it's constantly in flux, we should look to what is most recent. What is the most recent description?
You guys should keep in mind, do not point out that your evidence is newer unless you have a reason why it being newer is important. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time.
Right. Why? Because for certain scenarios, newness doesn't mean anything, right? Generally, right, for elections disads based on the 2016 presidential election, newness right now doesn't mean anything. But if a Congress scenario, if the Congress is in session and they're passing things, right, things are happening, whips are getting around doing stuff, then newness post-dating matters. Why?
Because it's constantly changing.
Exactly, right? The idea of the presidential election, while, yeah, still changing, it's not as important of a constant change. Let's talk about some generic scenarios, and then we'll take questions. So, we talked about this earlier. Obama good versus Obama bad, or Romney good.
What's the question?
We're talking about generic scenarios. What would an Obama's good scenario be, in general?
Like, not in terms of, like, elections.
Right. Jacob.
Lowered unemployment.
Okay. But in a disad scenario.
This isn't saying Obama's, like, a good or bad president, like, for clarification. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Kelly, why don't you explain?
Okay.
Because it seems like they're having trouble.
Okay, so Obama good scenario versus Obama's bad scenario is basically how Obama used political capital in simplest form. So an Obama good scenario would look like the piece of legislation in question is passing now, Obama's political capital is key, plan makes Obama lose his political capital, nuclear war. Alright?
So if that's the Obama good scenario, what would the Obama bad scenario be? So if Obama good is about Obama doing good things with political capital, plan costs political capital, good things can't happen, the Obama bad generic scenario is
It doesn't get passed.
Obama.
this one?
Obama gains political capital.
Right, and uses it for bad things. Exactly. Plan gives them political capital, right? Results in bad things because Obama is spending his political capital on bad things. Okay? So that relates to this scenario. So another generic scenario is like tensions and relations, right? This has to do with like bipartisan, right? If a bill is bipartisan environments are pretty hard to get, right? Especially post-government shutdown. So that would make a higher brink scenario than something if it's just the Democrats. Like if Democrats have control of the Senate, right? And it's something that only needs to happen in the Senate, and it's already passed through the House, and the Senate needs to confirm it, and the Democrats have enough votes for it, and it's really easy, right? Doesn't mean anything. On the other hand, if they need to get enough votes, they need independents to agree with them, and make sure the independents vote along their party lines, and then the independents don't like what the plan does, then that costs them political capital with the independents. Is this making sense? Okay.
Who knows what gridlock is?
Isn't it? Oh.
When either, like when one party will try to pass something, but the other like just tries to completely stop it so nothing gets done.
Basically, it's basically whatever, in this case probably the Democrats and Republicans, neither of them are willing to compromise on any form of legislation, so just get stuck in the debating process.
Make sense? Okay, any questions? This is an example that of a disad that Kelly ran a little while ago. So obviously not as inherent, right? Not as unique. But this is how she cut it, right? What's important is you don't want to just get Obama has political capital or Obama needs political capital. Like with every card, you need a warrant, right? Make sense? So look what she has here. Ooh, if you have something specific to the app, always better. This was a DA in terms of economic engagement with a couple countries near Latin America. So, oh look at this, major shifts in policy cause partisan battles. Right? This is the impact. Why the plan, why the original status quo thing, or why the change in the status quo was bad. Make sense? Our economic future depends on immigrants more than ever. Fastest growing sector of the economy. Best trained, hardest working people in the world. Best and brightest, here to study. We need to pass CIR, Comprehensive Immigration Reform, to unlock these contributions. Right? And, oh no, world goes boom. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Hopefully you guys have some more things to understand about politics scenarios. Hopefully no one's leaving more confused. Is anyone leaving more confused? It's okay if you are, I'll just go cry. Any other questions? Okay. Go to your labs.